Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation often dismissed as fragile, has just shaken the map of Africa. While Nigeria sinks deeper in oil debt, while Kenya bows before World Bank loans, while South Africa parades its platinum but remains chained to foreign finance, one of the continent's smallest states has bulldozed a new script into existence. 764 heavy machines stood beneath the Sahel sun, paid for not by donors, not by creditors, but by Burkinabe hands. This is not charity. This is not aid. This is sovereignty, a spectacle forged in steel, a declaration that dependency is a choice, not destiny. And so a question rises, carried far beyond Ouagadougou. If Burkina Faso can do this under sanctions, with fewer resources than its neighbors, what excuse remains for Africa's so-called giants? Do not look away. What comes next may change how Africa reads its own map. Subscribe and walk with us, for this is more than a headline. It is a hinge of history where dignity wrestles free from dependency and a new path begins to shine across the continent. On a blazing afternoon in Ouagadougou, rows upon rows of machines stretched out like an army awaiting command. Bulldozers, excavators, graders, compactors, 764 of them, stood in perfect formation beneath the unrelenting Sahel sun. The ground shimmered with heat, but what truly burned that day was not the sky above. It was the message delivered in silence. No European commissioner hovered with a speech. No World Bank official stood with scissors in hand. No foreign minister arrived to remind Burkina Faso of fiscal discipline. The machines themselves were the speech, a silent sermon cast in steel. For decades, the script in Africa has been predictable. A bridge opens and donor flags flutter beside it. A highway is cut and the plaque reads not the name of the nation, but the generosity of outsiders. African presidents dressed in immaculate suits pose like grateful pupils beside international financiers who dictate both the money and the mood. Sovereignty becomes a ribbon to be cut by someone else's hand. Burkina Faso tore up that script in one afternoon. The ceremony was brief. No extravagant words, no foreign anthem. Yet its brevity was the power. What stood in the dust of Ouagadougou was more than machinery. It was a redefinition of power itself. A country with fewer resources than Nigeria, with less global clout than Kenya, with far less industrial scale than South Africa, had delivered what those so-called giants could not: infrastructure without dependency. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Machines are not just tools. They are promises made tangible. They are seeds of sovereignty forged in iron. For a continent used to associating progress with external partners, the sight of Burkinabe finance bulldozers was nothing short of a political earthquake. This was not a gift. This was not a loan. This was not a project to be repaid in gratitude. This was an investment in dignity, a declaration that Africa can build Africa. And so commentators scrambled. Some downplayed it as symbolic. Others whispered the machines would soon rust. Yet behind every dismissal lay unease, because the truth gnawed at them. Burkina Faso had achieved what larger economies had failed to do. It had proven that aid dependency is not natural law. It is a political choice. That was the sting. Not the 764 machines themselves, but the reminder that sovereignty had always been within reach if only leaders dared to claim it. The images traveled faster than speeches. Across Mali, Niger, Côte d'Ivoire, citizens shared the photographs with pride, asking, if a landlocked state under sanctions can marshal its own wealth, what excuse remains for us? In Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, the comparison was unavoidable. Why could the so-called regional giants with oil, technology, and platinum not do what a fragile Sahelian state had just done? Every machine carried more than metal. It carried humiliation for those still tethered to donor conferences. It carried inspiration for the millions told that development could only arrive wrapped in foreign flags. For once, Africa's narrative was not written in the offices of Washington or Brussels. It was written in the dust of Ouagadougou, with the roar of engines that answered to no outsider. And that roar echoes beyond infrastructure. It forces a question upon the entire continent. If a nation scarred by conflict, deprived of ports, and dismissed as marginal can stage such a spectacle of sovereignty, what does that say about the rest of Africa? The machines were not just lining a field. They were lining history itself, daring others to follow. If Burkina Faso could marshal this army of steel, what hidden source of strength made it possible? The spectacle in Ouagadougou did not end with the lining of machines. In many ways, that was merely the spark. What followed was a wave of astonishment, outrage, and pride that rippled across Africa. The sight of 764 machines, unbranded, unmarked by donor logos, unsettled more than the old colonial powers. It rattled the very heart of Africa's so-called giants. In Abuja, analysts scrambled to frame the narrative. Nigeria, with oil revenues dwarfing Burkina Faso's entire economy, was suddenly confronted with an uncomfortable mirror. For years, Abuja had preached development, yet its citizens still drowned in poverty and its government in debt. The question spread through cafes and classrooms alike. If tiny Burkina Faso can marshal its own resources, why not us? In Nairobi, the self-proclaimed hub of African innovation, the mood was no less tense. Kenya's leaders, proud of their Silicon Savannah and regional prestige, faced the humiliation of comparison. The photographs of bulldozers lined in the Sahel were circulated with biting captions. Kenya has apps. Burkina Faso has machines. Behind the humor lay frustration, a recognition that while Kenya excelled in startups, its highways and bridges still bore the signatures of the World Bank and China. South Africa, the industrial titan of the continent, did not escape either. Johannesburg's press noted with unease that a nation under sanctions, with far less capital, had delivered what Pretoria had failed to: visible, sovereign-funded infrastructure. Commentators whispered of a small state shaming the giant. And across Francophone Africa, the symbolism was even sharper. In Mali and Niger, neighbors scarred by coups and sanctions, citizens saw in Burkina Faso not just a government action, but a continental declaration. Social media posts surged with one question, repeated in Bambara, Hausa, French. If Burkina Faso can, what excuse do we have? Yet the sting did not stop at Africa's borders. In Paris, London, and Washington, the silence was telling. There were no congratulatory press releases, no donor statements of solidarity. Instead, Western media sought to reframe the story. Articles warned of unsustainable populism and risk to investor confidence. But beneath the jargon lay unease. What truly unsettled the international order was not the machines themselves, but the precedent they set. For decades, aid had not just financed projects. It had financed dependency. It had entrenched a psychology of gratitude. A bridge or hospital arrived, stamped with donor insignia, and African leaders were expected to bow in appreciation. Burkina Faso broke that ritual. There was no bow, no thanks, no donor to applaud. The silence of the ceremony was louder than any speech, and it traveled far. Ordinary Africans embraced that silence as their own. The absence of foreign voices became a chorus of dignity. Radio callers in Bamako praised it as the day Africa stood tall. Comment sections on Nairobi blogs filled with demands for local ownership. Even in Lagos, where skepticism runs deep, citizens admitted they felt a rare twinge of pride, not in their own government, but in their continental neighbor. Of course, critics moved quickly to dismiss the announcement. Economists predicted the machines would fall into disrepair. Opposition voices argued the gesture was symbolic theater. Yet every attempt to belittle the event only confirmed its power. For symbolism is the currency of politics, and on that day, Burkina Faso spent it with abundance. The moment of climax arrived not in words, but in images. Wide-angle photographs captured the endless rows of yellow steel, glistening like a new horizon under the Sahel sun. For many Africans, it was the first time in memory that sovereignty was not a slogan on a podium, but a tangible object that could be seen, touched, and believed. And therein lay the danger for the old order. Speeches can be ignored. Reports can be dismissed, but machines cannot be denied. They stand immovable, proof that a different path exists, proof that development without dependency is not just theory, but practice. That is why the sight of steel cut deeper than any manifesto. It was a climax of imagination as much as politics. Citizens across the continent suddenly glimpsed a future where governments did not beg for grants, but delivered with their own hands. A future where dignity was not deferred to donors, but reclaimed from the soil. And so the question spread, like fire across dry grass. If Burkina Faso could marshal such sovereignty, what was the source of its strength? What hidden well of wealth had fueled this defiance? And how had one of Africa's poorest nations summoned the resources to buy freedom in steel? If the machines were the evidence, then gold was the motive. For decades, Burkina Faso had been a paradox. One of Africa's leading gold producers, yet among its poorest nations. Tons of ore left its soil, shipped abroad to be refined, enriching foreign vaults while Burkina Faso citizens were told to tighten their belts. Aid filled the gap, donors posed for photographs, and the cycle of dependency spun on. That is, until Captain Ibrahim Traoré made the radical decision to seize back the veins of wealth that pulsed beneath Burkina Faso soil. Strategic mines were brought under national control. Contracts that siphoned profits abroad were suspended. Foreign operators were told bluntly the game had changed. For the first time since independence, Burkina Faso gold would fund Burkina Faso development. It was not borrowed money. It was not conditional aid. It was sovereign money, answering only to the people who lived above the soil from which it came. The transformation was swift. Treasury accounts, once anemic and reliant on external disbursements, began to breathe again. Revenues redirected from gold poured into the state budget, and suddenly the impossible became tangible. 764 construction machines were bought, not with donor checks, but with Burkina Faso wealth. The symbolism was as powerful as the delivery itself. Stolen treasure repatriated in the form of steel. But the consequences stretched far beyond the machines. In the countryside, new irrigation projects broke ground. Seeds and tools were distributed not as charity handouts, but as investments in sovereignty. Processing plants for tomatoes and rice began to rise, ensuring that farmers' labor would no longer rot in the fields, while supermarket shelves filled with imports. For once, agriculture was treated not as a donor-funded pilot scheme, but as the front line of independence. The political impact was no less seismic. For decades, dependency had bred corruption. Aid money provided a steady stream for bureaucrats, ministers, and networks of rent-seekers who thrived on managing foreign funds. Each donor program created new layers of gatekeepers and opportunities for graft. The people saw little change, while elites grew fat on contracts and commissions. By cutting the aid pipeline, Traoré starved the parasites. This was the unspoken revolution. By refusing loans and freezing donor projects, the government forced itself to live and die by its own revenues. Accountability shifted. For the first time in years, citizens could see their taxes and their nation's resources visibly at work. In buses that ran, in clinics that opened, in bulldozers lined under the sun. Visibility killed the shield of secrecy that corruption had long thrived on. The symbolism mattered. When wealth flows from foreign capitals, accountability flows outward. When wealth flows from national soil, accountability flows inward, to the people. Citizens began to feel that development was not a favor from outsiders, but a right owed by their own state. And with that right came a shift in the social contract. This is where the Ibrahim Traoré coup takes on deeper meaning. It was not merely a seizure of power in the military sense. It was a rupture in the economic order that had chained Burkina Faso for decades. By redirecting gold revenues from foreign corporations to national projects, Traoré reframed sovereignty not as rhetoric but as practice. It was a coup against dependency itself. The risks, of course, remain immense. Sovereign money can empower, but it can also tempt. Gold revenues must be guarded against the very corruption they were meant to end. If transparency falters, if funds vanish into private accounts, then sovereignty collapses into hollow slogans once again. The government has responded with investigations, dismissals, and promises of reform. But whether this vigilance holds in the long run remains a question that history will judge. Yet for ordinary citizens, the immediate effects are undeniable. For the first time, they do not simply hear about funds on government balance sheets. They see them in machines and harvests in visible projects. That visibility feeds pride. It feeds hope. It begins to restore a sense of dignity long denied by the rituals of dependency. And so Burkina Faso has planted a seed of governance that grows not from borrowed fertilizer, but from native soil. Its sprouting is fragile, yet its roots run deep, into gold reclaimed, into food produced, into corruption confronted. But machines and gold alone cannot nourish a nation. What happens when the battle shifts to the most essential frontier of all, the sovereignty of food? When the images of 764 machines circled the globe, the international reaction was telling. From Addis Ababa to Brussels, from Washington to Paris, the event in Ouagadougou was dissected not as a mere procurement of equipment, but as a political statement, one that unsettled entrenched hierarchies of power. The African Union praised the symbolism of self-reliance, yet behind the applause was unease. If one of the continent's smallest economies could redirect its wealth to infrastructure, what excuse remained for Africa's giants who depend so heavily on international loans? Within ECOWAS, the silence was even sharper. Some leaders hesitated to acknowledge the achievement at all, fearing it might embolden their own citizens to demand similar sovereignty. For regional elites accustomed to the comfort of donor conferences, Burkina Faso's spectacle was a dangerous precedent. In Europe, reactions oscillated between skepticism and concern. Brussels officials warned of unsustainable populism, framing the move as a political stunt rather than a viable model. Paris, once accustomed to unchallenged influence in Francophone Africa, was stung more deeply. Commentators noted with bitterness that a former colony had managed to assert a degree of independence that undermined decades of French leverage. The United States, meanwhile, adopted its characteristic language of caution. Analysts spoke of risks to investor confidence and threats to stability. But the translation was clear. Washington's concern was not about Burkina sovereignty, but about disrupted flows of profit and access in a region where strategic minerals and military positioning matter deeply. The Sahel is no longer just a frontier of counterterrorism for the U.S. It is also a theater where economic independence threatens to redraw alliances. What made the announcement of machines more powerful than any fiery speech was precisely its irrefutable materiality. Words can be dismissed as rhetoric, but bulldozers cannot. They stand as proof that sovereignty, once thought utopian, is attainable. For Western capitals, that proof was far more destabilizing than protests or coups, for it meant that the narrative of dependency, long used to justify intervention, aid, and control, had been pierced by reality itself. International think tanks scrambled to frame the story as an exception rather than a model. Reports insisted that Burkina Faso's act was unique, not scalable, not sustainable. Yet the very need for such disclaimers revealed their fear. If even one landlocked, sanction-stricken state could fund its own development, then the entire architecture of aid and external control stood exposed. This is the essence of the Burkina Faso revolution, not simply reclaiming gold or feeding its people, but forcing the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Dependency is not destiny. It is policy. It is choice. And choices once made by one nation can be made by others. But sovereignty on paper and machines in rows still face the most unforgiving test. Can Burkina Faso turn reclaimed wealth into food and end the dependency of hunger itself? Gold can buy machines, but no nation can eat bulldozers. That realization shaped the next chapter of Burkina Faso's struggle for dignity, the battle for food sovereignty. For decades, the country's fertile soil was left underutilized, its farmers undersupported, and its markets flooded with imported rice and wheat. Every drought brought not resilience but dependency, as sacks of grains stamped with foreign flags arrived as lifelines. Aid became not humanitarianism but quiet domination, binding survival to outsiders' goodwill. Captain Traoré understood that sovereignty rooted only in minds is fragile. True independence requires control over the stomach as well as the soil. And so, resources reclaimed from gold were channeled into agriculture. Irrigation schemes expanded to blunt the impact of droughts. Seeds and tools were distributed, not as charity handouts, but as weapons of resistance in a war against hunger. Processing plants rose, ensuring tomatoes and rice no longer rotted in fields while supermarkets stocked foreign imports. The symbolism was clear. Every harvest grown by Burkina hands was a rejection of dependency. Every loaf of bread baked from domestic grain was a step away from manipulation. Because if donors can feed you, they can starve you. And if they can starve you, they own your future. To reclaim food was to reclaim freedom. This shift was not glamorous. There were no ribbon cuttings with foreign dignitaries, no plaques to mark donor generosity. Instead, the transformation was visible in markets where local produce gained ground, in rural households where imported rice was slowly replaced, in children who learned that survival need not carry the emblem of another nation. It was sovereignty written in harvests, yet challenges remain formidable. Climate change threatens rainfall. Global agricultural corporations still wield influence over seeds and pricing. And within, corruption lurks as a persistent danger. But the principle has been set. Sovereignty is no longer a slogan. It is an evolving practice, fought field by field, seed by seed. What lies ahead is a future uncertain yet full of possibility. If Burkina Faso can sustain this path, it will offer a model for an entire continent still chained by food imports and donor dependency. The lesson is stark. Independence is not built only with speeches or policies. It is cultivated in the soil, fed with courage, and defended with vigilance. And so a question rises once more. If one Sahelian nation scarred by war, sanctions, and scarcity can begin to feed itself with its own hands, what stops the rest of Africa from doing the same? The road ahead is long and perilous, but will the fortress of sovereignty hold when tested by time, pressure, and temptation? Burkina Faso has proven a truth long buried beneath layers of excuses. Dependency was never destiny. It was policy. It was choice. And choices, once reversed, can rewrite the story of a nation. 764 machines glisten under the Sahel sun, but their true weight is not in steel. It is in symbolism. They are declarations cast in iron, announcing that sovereignty can be forged when a people dare to reclaim what was always theirs. This journey has not been without risk. By seizing control of gold, by redirecting wealth to infrastructure, by investing in fields instead of waiting for handouts, the state has chosen the harder road, the road of responsibility. The Ibrahim Traoré coup is not just a moment in military history, it is a rupture in the psychology of dependency. It is the audacity to say, we will live by our own labor or not at all. For citizens, the change is tangible. They see sovereignty in bulldozers that carve roads, in hospitals that rise, in harvests that no longer carry foreign flags. For once, dignity is not deferred. It is present. It is visible. Yet this is not only Burkina Faso's story. It is a challenge thrown before the entire continent. If a landlocked state scarred by conflict and constrained by sanctions can reclaim its future, what excuse remains for nations far richer in resources? This is the heart of the Burkina Faso revolution, a reminder that freedom is not granted, it is taken. If this story stirs your sense of justice, do not stay silent. Subscribe, comment, and share, so this voice of sovereignty travels further. The Ibrahim Traoré coup will be remembered not merely as a transfer of power, but as the moment Africa glimpsed another path. A path where sovereignty is built not on borrowed promises, but on native soil, on reclaimed wealth, on dignity too long denied. And the question remains for every nation still tied to donor strings. If Burkina Faso can, why not you?